Well, joining me now to discuss events in the Middle East and the state of al-Qaeda since the death of Osama bin Laden is Nicholas Burns, former US Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs and US Ambassador to NATO during the George W. Bush administration. Nicholas Burns, many thanks for talking to Lateline.
Thank you.
Let's start with Yemen and the events in that country, particularly over the weekend. The Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh is now in Saudi Arabia receiving medical treatment. Protesters are flying flags with the words "New Yemen." Do you think it is?
It's hard to say because, this is a country that's quite different than Egypt or Tunisia. It's not homogeneous. It's separated by historical rivalries among tribes. It's been highly unstable, really, for the last 20 or 30 years. And for President Ali Saleh to leave now, the question is there going to be solid central stability and authority? And it's a very consequential country for the rest of the world because al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is a tributary, if you will, of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, is a very powerful terrorist group responsible for some of the attempted attacks in the U.S., over the ones that have failed, in the U.S. over the last several years, and for some that have succeeded in the Middle East. So what happens there is really important.
Indeed, the CIA actually says that al-Qaeda in Yemen is a more potent threat than al-Qaeda in Pakistan.
The U.S. government has been of that view for several months right now. It's an extraordinary statement to think about. I mean, striking at Osama bin Laden and killing him was a very significant development. It was a huge blow to al-Qaeda. But al-Qaeda has all these franchises, if you will, these other operations that might be mildly limited, in a limited way, connected to the main organization, and some of them are more powerful than the home base, and that's certainly true of Yemen.
And is there already evidence that al-Qaeda in Yemen is capitalizing on the unrest, on the turmoil?
One would think it would. I don't think al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has a desire to run the government, but they certainly want to have more influence, and they want to have an environment where the government is not launching counterterrorism operations against it. The government of President Ali Saleh has been many things. It's been highly imperfect. You've seen the use of force against demonstrators, which is highly objectionable. But they have tried to strike out against the terrorist groups over the last 5 to 10 years. They've been a very important partner of the United States. And so in this particular case, a change of government in Yemen might not add up to either stability for the Yemeni people and certainly might not be beneficial to countries like my own that have an interest in seeing terrorist groups put down.
So what does America do in this instance? Because I suppose it's worth noting, as we just heard in that report, that it wasn't in fact the protesters who managed to get the president out of the country in the end. It was the very, very powerful tribes who managed to get him out. What do you think, first of all, I guess, is the most likely outcome at this point? And secondly, what role will the US play?
I think the most likely outcome is he's not going to come back. He's not going to emerge from that hospital in Riyadh and suddenly appear in Sana'a and take over again. Despite the fact his government's in power, he's been negotiating an exit agreement for himself for the last 3 or 4 months.
But he's been refusing to sign constantly.
Exactly right. He agrees to it and then he backs off. The U.S. government decided some time ago, about a month ago, that it wouldn't support him any longer. It felt that he'd lost credibility in the country and that we had to take our chances with a successor.
What about Saudi Arabia? Of course, it's a very big security issue for Saudi Arabia. What role will they play, and what line do you think they will take?
Well, the Saudis are very nervous. The Saudis have intervened militarily in Yemen just in the last year when some of this tribal infighting had broken out. And, of course, you saw what happened when the Saudis became nervous about Bahrain a couple of months ago, the demonstrations there. They sent Saudi troops. So I wouldn't think it's beyond the realm of the possible that if Saudi Arabia saw the situation in Yemen heading in a direction that was fundamentally against its own interests, it might inject its own military forces. The Saudis are very, very worried, not so much about instability within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but the borders, and particularly Yemen and Bahrain.
And how would the U.S. respond to that?
The U.S. would be, I don't think the U.S. would want to see Saudi Arabia take on that kind of regional security role. It has a lot of risks. But then again, you've seen President Obama react quite differently to Saudi Arabia during the last 6 months of this Arab transformation than he did, say, in Egypt or Tunisia. We were quite willing to cast aside our relationship with President Ben Ali in Tunisia, President Mubarak in Egypt, not willing to do so in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because we have really significant security interests tied up in Saudi Arabia. Think of it this way. Countering these terrorist groups, that's an occupation we have with the Saudis. Containing Iran, the long-range threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, and also, frankly, the oil and gas that comes out of Saudi Arabia, all of that amounts to, in essence, a hands-off policy, where the U.S. and other countries are not going to push for the kind of reform in Saudi Arabia that you've seen us push for in the Levant and in North Africa.
It makes the US look incredibly hypocritical, doesn't it?
I don't think it is hypocritical. I think in essence, the United States, like any other country, has to protect its own interests. And in some cases, we certainly want to see democracy develop, if it can develop in the Arab world. We've made that bet in both Egypt and Tunisia. We're trying to make that bet in Libya by the use of military force to drive Gaddafi out. But on the other hand, we have real interests, concrete interests of an economic, geopolitical, counter-terrorist nature. It's difficult just to cast those aside. I wouldn't say it's hypocrisy. I think it's just recognizing that the Arab world has 22 countries, that these crises are going to play out in a very different way, one to the other, and that you have to protect your own interests in the process.
But it does amount to, though, doesn't it, in some cases, that the deaths of some are okay, the deaths of others are not?
I don't think the deaths of... I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that any country is going to be comfortable with the deaths of... Certainly not the deaths of protesters. I mean, the U.S. did object quite strenuously when the Bahraini government used physical force and killed innocent people in Pearl Square. It's just to suggest that every country is going to look at the Middle East not as a monolithic entity, but as a region that is very diverse, quite complex. And if you look at Egypt, for instance, there's a reasonable expectation that with some luck and with some hard work, we might see a democratic society develop slowly, gradually over time from the ground up. There's very little reason to think that will happen overnight in Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, you had millions of people demonstrating in the streets for change. In Saudi Arabia, you don't. So I think governments like Australia or the United States are going to react really to what the people are dictating on the ground in these countries.
In relation to Al-Qaeda, you say that it was weakened by the killing of bin Laden, but it has different chapters. How do you see, I suppose, Al-Qaeda now as a global force? I mean, substantially weakened with these chapters never being able to regain the strength that the organisation once held, or not?
I think Al-Qaeda has been substantially weakened because the founder of Al-Qaeda, the person who was really the heart and soul of the operation, was killed in the U.S. commando raid.
He can't just be replaced?
He can be replaced. He undoubtedly will be replaced. I think with some difficulty, however. I wouldn't say that this group is finished. That would be foolish and it would be naive to think that it's finished because these are hard-bitten people. They've proven that they're willing to go to extraordinary lengths to kill innocent civilians. They have a mission and ideology. And so this fight against terrorist groups goes on. It may be never-ending. It may go on for years and years, and therefore we've got to be attentive and we've got to be smart in the way we confront them.
I want to have a look at what that means for Afghanistan in a moment, but just staying on Yemen for a minute, because the Saudis have accused Iran of backing rebels in Yemen. Where do you see Iran fitting into this very changed landscape in the Middle East? Because, of course, you were the chief negotiator for America in the 3 years leading up to 2008.
I think Iran is playing a very interesting game. On the one hand, it's gone on the offensive. Iran is funding and arming most of the Middle East terrorist groups that have been inimical to the authoritarian regimes there, to the United States, to Israel, and to others. Iran is also a potential victim of the Arab transformation. So you see Iran on the one hand funding Hezbollah, funding Palestinian Islamic Jihad, trying to sow unrest in places like Yemen and Bahrain. It's in its interest to do that. On the other hand, the Iranians have to realize that if people power can succeed in the Middle East, if millions of people taking to the streets can topple governments, and that's what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, it could also happen in Iran. You remember what happened in June of 2009 when Ahmadinejad stole the election, if you will, from the Iranian people. Millions of people on the streets there. They were put down by brutal force, but those people still have a grievance against the Iranian government. So I think the Iranians are trying to capitalize. They're acting offensively, but they're also quite frightened of the Iranian regime.
You spent those 3 years trying to get Iran to the negotiating table. Do you see any indication now that sanctions against Iran, US sanctions, European sanctions, are actually working, that the Iranian regime has been weakened?
I think they're working. And I think they're necessary because the Iranians have turned down every invitation to negotiate from President Obama or President Bush, from the Russians and the Chinese. They're working. But they need to work. They need to be implemented in a much more serious way. You've seen financial sanctions now by the U.S. and the EU. I think if the sanctions go on long enough, and if the Iranians continue with their nuclear weapons development program, you'll probably see a call for sanctions against companies that do business with Iran, particularly in the oil and gas sphere.
What about the military option, though? Because, of course, just 2 weeks ago, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued a report that talked of quote, possible military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program. How close do you think they are to developing a nuclear weapon? What's the timeline, and how long can you be patient?
Well, it's clear that they're making progress. It's clear that they're working on this, but it's also clear that we have some time available to the U.S. and other countries to consider.
How much time?
Hard to say. I mean, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, would be the expert on that question. But time enough to construct a policy that might push the Iranians perhaps to the negotiating table. So I think the trick here is for the U.S. and other countries to keep the military option on the table. But I think it's very unlikely it'll be used in the short run. I think the vast preference of President Obama is to see Iran at the negotiating table, try to work out our differences through diplomacy. If that's not possible, then the option is not just for a military strike or offensive military operations. It's a containment regime. It's a long-term effort, in essence, to surround Iran, wait for the day when its government collapses, but not to take offensive military action.
You're also the former US ambassador to NATO. If we can turn to Libya, we've now got Britain and France deploying attack helicopters, and I note that the Russians say that's one step away from a land operation. Can NATO succeed?
I think it will. I had my doubts at the beginning. I didn't think a third land war in the Middle East made sense for my own country. But when the Arab League came and said, please intervene in the internal affairs of an Arab country, which is essentially what they did, when the Security Council blessed it, I think President Obama had no choice but to go in.
But of course the US has stepped back now.
It has. And the problem with the NATO operation is that NATO's had one arm tied behind its back because it's not used ground troops. It's only used offensive air power. And so there's been a stalemate over the last 2 months, but I think Gaddafi is beginning to weaken. You see people leaving his government, people going into exile. The finance minister, his foreign minister, the oil minister have all left. He's increasingly isolated. The EU has given diplomatic recognition and now some money to the rebel alliance in Benghazi. And I think it's only a matter of time now before either Gaddafi is overthrown from within his own inner circle, because people will be frightened to be associated with him. He's going to be indicted for war crimes. Or else he flees Libya and seeks refuge in some third country.
So you don't see the US wanting to take over the lead role again? You see them, the NATO forces?
President Obama does not wish to take over the lead role, not with two major engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. He wants the European allies, specifically Britain and France, to take the lead. But can those countries sustain the lead? Can they sustain major military operations for 3 or 4 months? Probably not. Such is the state of the European militaries. But I think Gaddafi might fall before then.
And if not?
If not, then I think you'll see NATO do what it has to do, perhaps with a reinsertion of a lead American role to finish the effort, because stalemate ends up in a Gaddafi victory. The only outcome, I think, that works for the Arab world, as well as for the US and NATO, is to see Gaddafi go from power.
Well, as you say, there's no appetite in the US to get involved in yet another war. And if we look at Afghanistan, just this weekend, US Defence Secretary Robert Gates said, quote, persistence would allow the US-led coalition to turn the corner in Afghanistan by the end of the year. It has been 10 years. What does success mean? And will the Allied forces ever get there?
You know, I don't think a conventional military victory of the type that we won in 1945 is possible in Afghanistan. Not in that particular country, not given the strength of the Taliban. So the strategy is to push the Taliban back and to have this military surge dent the offensive potential of what the Taliban is trying to do.
It's been 10 long years, though.
It's been a long time. And to quickly then go and turn towards a diplomatic strategy, meaning negotiations. And you already see the United States and the Afghan government trying to talk to elements of the opposition, the Taliban, and trying to convince them to go to the negotiating table. It really is probably the only way to achieve a ceasefire, achieve an end of this war. A conventional military victory, not possible in Afghanistan.
What does that mean, though, for President Obama, who just next month is due to start announcing the plans for the withdrawal of the US troops? How does he make that balance between keeping the line in Afghanistan, but also, I guess, satisfying the political imperative at home?
He had always foreseen that in July 2011 he would begin a drawdown, but he never said it would be substantial. And I think, given what Secretary Gates said over the weekend, I presume that the United States will leave a very substantial ground force in Afghanistan, because we need to put continued military pressure on the Taliban to convince them to go to the negotiating table. Here's where diplomacy and force are really integrated. So I wouldn't see any dramatic drawdown in numbers this summer or this autumn. I think it's too early for that.
And is that domestically, politically palatable going into a presidential election?
I think so. I think because the president will be able to say in 2012, he brought us out of Iraq. He campaigned in 2008 that Iraq was the wrong war. we should come out of it. All U.S. combat troops will have left by the end of this year. He said Afghanistan, however, required a longer-term effort, and we've said we're not going to leave until 2014. I think the American people will sustain that. I think, frankly, the economy will be a far larger and more prominent issue in the campaign.
Well, we've ranged through the world. Thank you very much for being so generous with your time, Nicholas Moon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.